Across Europe, North Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, an estimated 45 million people died, though some estimates put the figures as high as 60 million, in almost 6 years of bloodshed and brutality during World War II. On the eve of the deadliest war in history, a conference held in Munich in 1938 during which the leaders of Great Britain, France, and Italy agreed to allow Germany to annex certain areas of Czechoslovakia. The Munich conference came as a result of a long series of negotiations. Adolf Hitler had demanded the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain tried to talk him out of it. When Hitler would not back down and even extended his demands, Chamberlain decided to follow a policy of appeasement and to give in to Hitler on the issue, in the hope that Hitler would not make any more demands.
We are resolved that the method of consultation shall be the method adopted to deal with any other questions that may concern our two countries, and we are determined to continue our efforts to remove possible sources of difference and thus to contribute to assure the peace of Europe.
However, just 5 months later, Hitler broke the spirit of the agreement by dismembering the rest of Czechoslovakia. Hitler's true intentions for Europe were made very clear, and France and Britain ended up looking foolish and being discredited. The conflict began early on Friday, September 1, 1939, when Nazi Germany attacked Poland. Adolf Hitler's invasion of Germany's eastern neighbor followed soon after a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. The German invaders smashed Poland to defeat in barely a month. The method was that of blitzkrieg or lightning war, saturation bombing from the air and ground attack by fast motorized infantry and armored divisions. After Germany failed to respond to ultimatums to withdraw from Poland, Britain and France declared war. On September 17th, Soviet troops invaded Poland from the east and the country was partitioned under a secret clause in the non-aggression pact. When the Polish capital, Warsaw, surrendered on September 27th after 4 weeks of bombing, more than 60,000 Polish soldiers were dead and an estimated 25,000 civilians. By the end of the war, 6 million Poles had been killed. On May 30th through June 1st, 1940, Dunkirk, a small French seaport, became the focal point of World War II attention. Disaster in the Flanders began with the surrender of the Belgian army May 28th, which was then holding vital positions to the north of Dunkirk. Cut off from the main French army, the only alternative to surrender was evacuation by sea. Some 330,000 exhausted Allied troops were evacuated from a seemingly impossible position by an armada of assorted craft ranging from pleasure steamers to fishing boats, tiny yachts to Royal Naval destroyers. Described as a miracle of deliverance by British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, the 1940 evacuation of British troops from the shores of France is considered one of several key events which determined the outcome of World War II. September 1940 saw the German Luftwaffe bomb London ceaselessly for 57 grim days and nights. The aerial bombing of London was part of the Nazi blitzkrieg, known in Britain simply as the Blitz. The most devastating period was between September 1940 and May 1941, during which time 50,000 bombs were dropped, killing at least 43,000 people. Operation Barbarossa was the code name for the German invasion of Russia, launched without warning at dawn on June 22, 1941. In 4 years of bitter warfare, the Red Army rolled the Wehrmacht back from the gates of Moscow to the gates of Berlin, an achievement which cost Russia an estimated 13 million dead. Libya's Tobruk was another key battleground with 3,651 soldiers, mostly from Britain, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, buried in the Knightsbridge War Cemetery near Akrama, 25 kilometers west of Tobruk. Thousands of Libyans were also killed in the conflict. The siege of Tobruk from April to November 1941 lasted 240 days. In one move, the war being waged in Europe and the conflict in the Far East merged into one bitter struggle when Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. The raid crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Only one of 96 vessels at the Pearl Harbor base escaped serious damage. The death toll was high, 2,300 Americans dead and 1,200 injured.
The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Immediately, the United States, Great Britain, the Netherlands, East Indies, the British Dominions, and several Latin American nations entered the war against Japan. A few days later, Germany and Italy, together with their satellite nations, came down on the side of Japan. Guadalcanal, located on the Solomon Islands in the Pacific Ocean, was the scene of 6 months of severe fighting between Japanese and American troops and claimed the lives of some 38,000 soldiers. Singapore also suffered a brutal Japanese occupation from 1942 to 1945. As the massive German offensive ground to a halt in the winter mud and snow, the Russians delivered their first counter-strike. One of the bloodiest battles in the history of warfare saw Soviet forces defeat Nazi troops in the 6-month Battle of Stalingrad, which lasted from August 1942 to February 1943, killing about 2 million people in a decisive victory for the Red Army. For Russia and Germany, Stalin's city on the Volga was the turning point of the war in the east, and as the German 6th Army bled to death on the Volga, the Russians began the long trek westward, which was to end in Berlin. 5 weeks after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, that dragged the U.S. into
combat medals for the U.S.
In April 1943, in Nazi-occupied Poland, a few hundred underarmed Jewish youngsters picked an uneven fight with the Nazi occupiers in a month-long insurrection of Jewish fighters in the city's ghetto, known as the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Nearly 500,000 Jews from the ghetto had already been transported to the Nazis' Treblinka death camp. Around 6,000 of the civilian Jewish population of the ghetto, which the Germans carved out of the occupied Warsaw, died in the fighting, and about 50,000 were killed after it ended. The emptied ghetto was then burned to the ground. On February 4, 1945, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Franklin D. Roosevelt, the American president, met in the Crimean town of Yalta to plan a final defeat and occupation of Nazi Germany. They agreed that they would only accept unconditional surrender. Dresden in 1945 was a German city that was the scene of one of the fiercest and most controversial Allied bombing raids of World War II. Untouched by bombing, just months before the end of World War II, the city was attacked by 2 waves of British bombers, 3 hours apart on the night of February 13, 1945. The official death toll puts it at around 25,000, but many survivors believe that the number was higher as bodies were reduced to ashes in the firestorm. On April 30, 1945, the Soviet troops laying siege to Berlin, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun, retired to their bunker beneath the Chancellery. Both committed suicide, and charred remains believed to be theirs were found in a nearby bomb crater. It was at the end of the Third Reich, which Hitler claimed would last 1,000 years. The Nazi attempt at genocide left more than 6 million dead, with the Jews of Germany, Poland, and the Soviet Union being the most numerous among the victims. Britain's 70-year-old Prime Minister Winston Churchill gave his famous V for Victory sign, telling the people, "This is your victory."
Today is Victory in Europe Day. Tomorrow will also be Victory in Europe Day.
On May 8, 1945, the war in Europe came to an end. A conflict which in little more than 5 years had brought to the continent death and destruction unparalleled in its history. On the island of Iwo Jima, more than 30,000 U.S. Marines and 21,000 Japanese were locked in battle. The U.S. emerged victorious and the Japanese suffered crippling losses. Japanese resistance became fanatically courageous. Suicide pilots, the kamikaze, sped their planes into Allied targets. In the closing days of World War II, the U.S. B-29 superfortress Enola Gay, carrying 12 crew members, dropped the atomic bomb nicknamed Little Boy on Hiroshima. The death toll from the blast on August 6, 1945, by the end of the year was estimated at about 140,000, out of the total 350,000 who lived there at the time. 3 days after the Hiroshima bombing, the United States dropped an atomic bomb nicknamed Fat Man on Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, bringing World War II to an end.
Japan has today surrendered. The last of our enemies is laid low.
On September 2, 1945, a Japanese delegation headed by Foreign Minister Shigemitsu boarded the USS battleship Missouri to sign the surrender document.
I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan.
It was at the end of World War II, but the beginning of a new era in world politics and international relations.